Association. Very pleased today to have you joining us. Thank you so much. When we look at what's occurred with the industry overall, one of the really amazing things that's occurred is these partnerships with organizations that we share so much of the same challenges. So I'd like to acknowledge we have Arun with us from Go2HR, who is co-hosting today as well, and Christopher Nicholson with the Canada's West Ski Area Association. And it's my pleasure today to welcome all of you to this very important webinar. I'd like to acknowledge that we have 80 plus ski area attendants that have registered for today's webinar. We're just thrilled to have that kind of engagement from your sector. If you're new or unfamiliar with BCHA, we're the voice of the hotel and lodging community in the province. We work very closely with Christopher and Canada's West Ski Area Association, your regional, your provincial, and your local DMOs, really connecting opportunities and working together, not only during this pandemic, but looking forward now to times of recovery. I'd also just like to say I'm a big skier myself, and I'm really delighted to have you participating today. So our job as the BCHA is really to advocate on behalf of our community, both provincially, locally, and federally. Our seat at the table for the BC Restart Plan, you'll all be receiving all these this communication, the Restart Plan, the toolkit for industry as a whole. And it will, our goal is that that's a toolkit for you, for your employees, for your businesses, for your communications, so that you really know what this phase of the Restart Plan is all about. We advocate on issues such as short-term rentals, property tax, emerging issues of strata, condo taxation, liability, and insurance. We have a number of programs exclusive to our organization, and these programs can provide access to or financial savings for areas such as property insurance, payment processors, repair and maintenance, capital improvement funds like the Eco Fund. And we do encourage you to reach out to our team should you not currently be participating in some of those programs, because I can guarantee you when it looks at your bottom line and your recovery and into the future, I'm confident that some of our programs will be very beneficial. I see we have Mike McLeod here, and he is the fellow here from BCHA. His email is mike@bcha.com. I'd also like to acknowledge that today we have a sponsor, Portex Designs. And I'd like to acknowledge Portex Designs, which is based in Vancouver, BC. They create complete custom uniform designs for brands, and with a wide selection of fabric styles, uniforms, and functional, comfortable, and unique. So contact founder Tatiana Wensley for future information, and Tatiana's information is there for you. Now I'd like to just do some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. It will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A session. I'd like now to introduce Ryan Anderson. My sincere pleasure. Ryan and I participated in a webinar earlier this month, and I just know this content is going to be really important for all of us as operators on this changing landscape. Ryan is a partner at the Vancouver office of Mathews, Dinsdale and Clark, LLP. Ryan has worked in human resources field for over 2 decades and advises employers in all areas of workplace law. Ryan represents provincially and federally regulated employers concerning both labor relations, employment matters, including those concerning human rights issues, employment standards, employment contracts, termination of employee, workmen's compensation, occupational health and safety, union organizing, collective agreements, grievances and arbitration, progressive discipline, and investigations into employee misconduct. Ryan obviously has a significant background of expertise that he very thankfully and willingly is sharing with us today. Ryan, may I hand it over to you? Thanks for being here today.
Great, thank you. I must say I didn't notice that you'd embedded my picture in the introduction here. That happened to me once before, And as I looked up and saw my picture being broadcast to dozens and dozens of people, I realized I was wearing the exact same jacket and shirt, which leads all of the attendees to think I have one jacket and one shirt. I have more than one jacket and one shirt, but I'm wearing the same shirt right now, which is why I bring it up. I should be more careful. I should chuck this shirt out. Thank you for joining us. I hope you do find the information informative, and I think that you will, because I find the information informative. This has been a really fascinating time to be an employment lawyer over the last 12 to 14 months. I can't tell you how many times we've given advice, and then 6 days later, or 6 weeks later, sometimes 6 hours later, we need to adjust because the law has never evolved so quickly as it has during this challenging period. And in fact, Ingrid, you'll see a couple of slides today are a little different than they were just 10 days ago. So there is lots to learn here. There's a lot of open questions. This is going to be one of those presentations where 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now, we'll look back and say, yeah, some things changed, because a lot of this is certainly an evolution. We've got a fairly ambitious agenda. Today I'm going to go with some haste, but we'll leave lots of room for questions at the end. So we'll try and keep it punchy. I'm going to talk a little bit about infectious disease law. So what have we learned from the past? Touch on those areas we need to be concerned about: health and safety, worksafe BC, privacy, as well as human rights. Get to maybe your number one question. I've seen some of the questions that were posed before, and the core question is, can we do this? Can we mandate vaccinations? Should we mandate vaccinations? So we'll get right to the heart of that question, and then we'll have some open questions and discussion. This is a matter, first it was masks, and then it was testing, and now it's vaccinations. These are matters that touch on really important legal considerations and potential liabilities, very practical considerations, not the least of which is employee morale and employee relations generally. There's even political considerations, because these matters have become quite political. So as an organization, you're trying to manage your reputation and your perception in the public field. There's a medical aspect to it, in as much as we're dealing with the duty to accommodate, the vaccine hesitancy and the like. And, when you mix all those really important considerations together, you don't get an easy topic. You don't get easy answers. And that's what you're going to see throughout this. So when I go looking for answers, and I think probably most of us have done a version of this, and in fact, preparing a version of this presentation a little while ago, I'm typing in some search terms, and I'm thinking, well, where do I get some guidance? Where do I get some answers? So like any good lawyer, I start with Google, and I type in a pretty basic question, and I find a very promising FAQ from WorkSafe BC. So there's a pretty good authority on the topic of safety in the workplace and vaccines. And I come across this question published by WorkSafe BC. Can an employee require a vaccination as a condition of employment? Well, perfect. This is one-stop shopping. WorkSafe BC is going to tell me what to do. And then I find the answer, and it says every workplace is different, so individual employers should seek legal advice when developing a mandatory vaccination policy. You got to address workplace health and safety, employee interest, and labor and employment issues. So it turns out WorkSafe BC is fantastic marketing for the lawyer community. It's a bit of a bait and switch there, but that's an accurate answer. I won't stop here, because that would be a very disappointing presentation, but it is the answer, is that it's very much a case-by-case assessment. And I'm going to walk you through some of the most important considerations as you're dealing with this really challenging question. What you're worried about is liability, right? And it's legal liability, and it's employee relations liability. But on the legal liability side, you're concerned about a couple of things. You're worried about human rights complaints. You're worried about occupational health and safety complaints, the engagement of WorkSafe BC, potentially privacy complaints. When you're asking somebody about the medical treatment they've received, that is legally defined as private information, so it engages the privacy statutes. In a labor context, you're certainly worried about union management relations and grievances, which you'll have to defend or navigate your way through. Wrongful dismissal suits, those folks who might find themselves with detrimental consequences in their employment context if they refuse to vaccinate, may sue their employer for damages. WorkSafe BC claims, dealing both with complaints about unsafe work or the very probably low percentage chance that they suffer a medical response to a vaccination that they felt was mandatory. Now they consider that to be a workplace injury. And then I don't think anybody on this call is likely to face a charter challenge in as much as that has to do with government authority, but we will see, I think, some charter challenges in the government context, which will be very guiding for employers in all sectors. And so again, it's touching on a whole bunch of different areas of the law and potential liabilities, and we'll touch on each of those as we go through. So another thing that lawyers do is we go look into the past to try and predict the future, right? So I'd like to go back and take a look at, well, look, vaccinations aren't new. You know, we've had the flu shot for a long time and all sorts of other vaccinations for serious infectious diseases. So surely employers have grappled with these problems before. What does the law say before us? And when we look at that, we say a few things. First, there is currently no legislation that mandates vaccine, right? So there isn't a law yet in Canada that says you must be vaccinated. Whether that's going to change or not is still kind of an open question. I'll get to that in a couple of bullets. When we look at previous case law on vaccination, it's guided very significantly by the evidence and science at the time regarding the efficacy of that vaccine. A real key to the policy arguments here in favor of mandatory vaccination is whether or not the vaccine is reasonably necessary and effective in the workplace. It's unlikely that I'm ever going to be able to say to any group in a presentation that all of you employers, every employer is going to be able to enforce a mandatory vaccination policy. The reality is that question will always have to be answered on a case-by-case basis. There's never going to be a single bright line answer for all employers. You know, right now we see governments and public health officials saying that vaccination is likely to be mandatory in all workplaces, even high-risk workplaces, until political will starts to blow the other way. And just recently, this is a bullet that's changed, Ingrid. We see Bonnie Henry in the last week to 10 days saying, well, we're still looking at this, and maybe in high-risk workplaces, healthcare in particular, we might look at a mandatory vaccination policy. And they'd be doing that not just by way of government policy, but by virtue of the fact that they're also an employer in many of these workplaces. So we might see that change. I don't think any lawyer believes that there's going to be a piece of legislation in British Columbia that mandates vaccination for all citizens in all circumstances. You know, what we've seen a lot through the pandemic is government, you know, putting up policies or putting up legislation, but leaving the details to employers to sort it out. So I don't think we're going to see government take on that challenge and say, we'll make the decision for all employers and make it a legislative requirement for citizens. I think we're going to see that everywhere, but stay tuned. When we look back to those previous cases, we look at SARS, we look at the influenza vaccine, we look a little bit at vaccines for other things like tuberculosis and measles and such. When you see adjudication in the past on these issues, the key considerations are the seriousness of the illness, just how important is it for a person to be vaccinated? What's the consequence of them contracting the disease in question, or the consequence of those vaccination or mask? And in fact, there's even an acronym for it. It's VOM, vaccinate or mask. So those sorts of policies have been around for a while in the context of a flu shot. Similarly, another case in 2006, arbitrator Burke set a policy requiring employees to get vaccination that also allows them to refuse the vaccination in certain circumstances was fair. And again, here they were able to go on an unpaid leave or access their vacation pay or bank time, and it was limited to the period of a flu outbreak, which is important. And again, for context, these are cases where there was actual language in a collective agreement where the parties had already agreed to some form of a vaccination policy, and then it was just tested in the particular circumstances. Alberta, similarly, bit of a messed up slide here. Alberta, similarly, about vaccinations, both blessed in these cases, 1999 and 2002, both focused on vaccination during an outbreak. So it was a mandatory policy, but that policy only kicked into place when there was evidence of a flu outbreak in a care home. So again, you know, very unique circumstances, not universally applicable to what we see in private sector workplaces, not serving vulnerable customers or groups. In Ontario, there's a line of cases that didn't go in the favor of employers. A vaccination or mask policy at a care home in the Sioux area hospital was found to be an unreasonable exercise of management rights. And in fact, the arbitrator called it a coercive tool. The vaccination policy was found to be a coercive tool that was supported by scant evidence concerning asymptomatic transmission. So that might not be a terribly applicable case in the experience of COVID, which is highly transmissible asymptomatically. The hospital then modified its policy to say now it's just a recommendation that you vaccinate or wear a mask, and that was still found to be unreasonable in the circumstances. And again, here the arbitrator said that there just wasn't enough scientific evidence. Again, what I focus on these cases is that if you're compelled to justify a vaccination policy, it's going to really turn on the scientific evidence of the efficacy of the vaccine. That only one really important criteria. Again, in Ontario, another one struck down, a vaccination or mask policy was struck down because there just wasn't enough persuasive expert evidence on the effectiveness of the policy. And you know, again, this is 2018. This is the kind of challenge you'll face in the workplace is before you tell someone to put a substance in their body that they'd rather not put in their body, you're going to have to demonstrate that the alternative safety measures are not sufficiently effective in your workplace. That's going to be a real challenge for employers. And we know from these previous cases, that's what the challenge is going to look like. One did go the employer's way in Ontario, where a policy providing mandatory unpaid leave for unvaccinated nurses was permissible, but only during the period of an outbreak. And again, a really important distinguishing feature of this case is that the union and the employer had already agreed on a mandatory vaccination policy, and all they were arguing about is whether or not there was actually an outbreak. So again, very, very specific to the workplaces, very, very heavily based on the science and the scientific evidence in those cases. So what's sort of the takeaway from this? It's that there is no bright line, right? We know what the test is going to look like. We know what kind of challenges the employers will face if they are compelled to defend a mandatory vaccination policy, but there isn't a bright line. It will always be case by case. We know that the nature of the workplace is going to be absolutely key. And unfortunately, I'm only showing you healthcare cases because that's what the case law is. They're focused in healthcare settings. And as I said, the science and the efficacy of not just the vaccine, but the alternatives will be critical to the outcome of those cases. So now, what are the key considerations? First, I like to break this down into sort of two questions. The first is, do employers have an obligation to ensure their employees are vaccinated? So is vaccination tied to any kind of legal obligation? And I'm going to break that down a little bit in the next slides. And then the second question is, okay, well, if it's not a legal obligation, can employers choose to require that their employees become vaccinated? So can you make vaccination mandatory absent any legal obligation? So first we look at occupational health and safety. And as I said at the outset, currently there is no legislation in British Columbia that requires any group of employees to be vaccinated to COVID-19. That doesn't appear likely to change in the private sector, in all sectors, but we might see change. We might see change in healthcare sector, and that might tend to influence what private sector employers are able to do and able to defend in the courts and before the tribunals. But currently, right now, there isn't a legislative requirement. The question I get all the time is, but hold on, don't I have a general duty under the occupational health and safety legislation to ensure a safe workplace? Like I have to, as an employer, ensure that my employees are safe. And if COVID is a risk, can't I rely on this general duty to impose vaccination? And right now the answer is no. And in fact, if you click to the WorkSafe BC question, just like I did, right, the body that's responsible for administering occupational health and safety legislation doesn't answer the question, yes, you have a general duty obligation to vaccinate your employees. They say get legal advice. It's a case-by-case basis. So this general obligation to provide a safe workplace is not going to be sufficient to rely upon to say I have a legal obligation, absent some other supporting statute down the road. There's another consideration is that if you make a vaccination mandatory in a workplace, and I'm skipping ahead one. Let me give you another piece. The question is, what happens if one of my employees contracts COVID while they're at work? Don't I expose myself to a potential WorkSafe BC claim? And if I'm exposed to a potential WorkSafe BC claim, isn't that enough for me to say, well, I'm making vaccination mandatory because I don't want to have WorkSafe BC claims? I heard one employer put it quite simply, saying, I require that my employees wear steel-toed boots. Not because WorkSafe BC says I have to, but because there were a couple of foot injuries in my workplace and I don't want any more WorkSafe BC claims. So I made that mandatory. The answer here is, again, no. The risk of a potential WorkSafe BC claim because somebody caught COVID while they were at work is not enough to say I have a legal obligation to make vaccination mandatory. And in fact, there have been very few successful WorkSafe BC claims where a worker has said, I contracted COVID while at work and now I want to be compensated while I'm off. In order for that kind of a claim to be successful, the employee has to show that first, there's evidence of a COVID outbreak at the workplace, and two, that the risk of contracting the disease at work was significantly greater than the ordinary risk in public. So that's how the case law is developing right now. And so the fact that you might have picked it up at work is not sufficient to support a successful claim unless you can show that the risk of catching it at work was significantly greater than the ordinary risk in the public. And then there's some privacy considerations. So we know that you're not compelled by law then currently to have your employees vaccinated, to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And we also have to consider privacy concerns. And there's no doubt that having somebody disclose the medical treatment that they have received, disclose the fact that they've been vaccinated or the fact that they haven't, is private information for the purposes of the privacy legislation. So vaccination status is personal health information, which triggers all of the obligations under the applicable privacy legislation. So at minimum, if you're going to be asking employees to disclose their vaccination status, you're going to want to have a policy, or at least a policy statement, that addresses a couple of key concerns. The first is precisely what are you asking, right? You probably don't need to know what kind of vaccination they received. You probably just need to know that they were vaccinated and when they were vaccinated. You're going to want to have a statement about how it will be stored, who that information is going to be shared with, how that information is going to be used, and when it will be destroyed, how long will it be kept for. And that's really important in terms of not just meeting the obligations under the privacy statutes, but it also goes to the question, is this policy mandatory or not? I'll give you an example. If you were to say, I'm going to ask you to disclose your vaccination status, but I don't need you to hand me anything. I'm not going to record anything. I'm only going to record your name and a yes, because the only way I'm going to use this information is to advertise the percentage of vaccinated employees in my workplace. And we've seen that on the news. There's a few outlets that are saying our employees here at this location are 95% vaccinated or 90% vaccinated. If you're telling an employee that, you're not telling them that it's a mandatory vaccination policy. You're just telling them that you want to report aggregate numbers. Whereas on the other hand, if you're going to be saying, tell me whether you're vaccinated or not, because if you're not vaccinated, then I'm going to have to treat you differently. I might assign you to different work. I might require that you use different kinds of PPE. I might require that you go on leave until the pandemic is largely over. I might impose some workplace consequences on you. Now that's starting to sound a little more like a mandatory vaccination policy. Even though you're not going to hold me down and actually physically vaccinate me, you're not forcing me to be vaccinated. But if I'm not, I'm going to suffer a workplace consequence, and that makes it feel mandatory. You're also, in that kind of circumstance, going to have to deal with accommodation concerns, which takes us to human rights in the next slide. So if I say I'm not going to get vaccinated, that leads to the question of why, and does that trigger a duty to accommodate, which is the next topic. So in British Columbia, like all the jurisdictions across Canada, the BC Human Rights Code prohibits employers from refusing to employ somebody, terminating somebody, or treating them adversely in the workplace on the basis of a protected ground. So in the context of vaccination, if an employee was to say, employer, I'm not going to get vaccinated, the next question is why? And if they're saying I'm not going to get vaccinated because I have a mental condition, or maybe a mental condition, a medical condition that prevents me from being vaccinated, now they're basically saying I'm not getting vaccinated because I'm disabled. Or they might say, and this was an issue, maybe it was more significant several weeks ago, because there's been some good studies that support vaccination for those who are pregnant. Someone might say, I'm not getting vaccinated because I'm pregnant, or I'm planning to become pregnant. That triggers the protected ground under the legislation. Or they might say it's because of my religion. I'm not going to get vaccinated because my religious beliefs prevent me from doing so. Another wild card one, a protected ground under the statute, is political belief. Someone might say, I'm not getting vaccinated because of my political belief. We think that would be a much more difficult argument for an employee to sustain. But a really important piece of this policy question is that if you're asking for this information on vaccination status, certainly if you're making it mandatory and imposing consequences, as an employer and as a proprietor of a service that you give to the public, you're going to have to be prepared to identify these potential protected grounds, and that will trigger your duty to accommodate them. And so if that happens as an employer in the employer context, you're going to need some more information in terms of the employee who says, I cannot be vaccinated because of a medical condition. You have the right as an employer to ask for more information. You have to do that carefully, and we can help you with that in terms of how you put the question to the employee. But you are able to get confirmation that there is a legitimate medical concern that prevents the employee from being vaccinated. Similarly, if it's a religious prohibition, you're able to ask certain questions carefully in order to assess the veracity of that religious belief. Political belief, as I said, I think will be even more difficult for an employee to establish. But there's no doubt about this. If an employee refuses vaccination or indicates to you that they're not going to be vaccinated for a reason that touches on a protected ground under the Human Rights Code, that will always trigger your duty to accommodate. It doesn't mean that you have to accommodate, but you certainly have a duty to inquire. You have a duty to inform yourself of the employee's reasons and then determine whether or not you're going to accommodate that protected ground. And the question of accommodation is essentially a bona fide occupational requirement question, right? So you're saying to yourself and to the employee, I want you to become vaccinated. You're raising an objection to that vaccination based on a protected ground. Now I have to decide whether or not I can accommodate you. And that'll trigger these questions. You know, is your vaccination policy rationally connected to the workplace, the specific nature of your workplace? Have you implemented it in an honest and good faith belief that it's necessary? And that's really the third question that's the tough one is it actually necessary? Is there no other alternative that would allow you to have the employee continue to working and not be treated adversely without imposing an undue hardship on the employer? So you're really going to have to look carefully at your work environment. And we're going to all have to watch the COVID data and status. You know, the conversation we're having today is in the context of, I think it was 68 positive cases yesterday. You know, the numbers are going down, hospitalization is going down. You know, once we get to a place in this pandemic where, you know, infection rates are exceptionally low and hospitalization rates are exceptionally low, it's going to become more and more difficult to justify a mandatory vaccination policy. So these are the sorts of things you'll have to consider in the human rights context. So then we get to those are all the key considerations. And then we get to the real key question is, you know, which sort of a vaccination policy are you going to want to impose or want to apply in your workplace? So it's mandatory or voluntary. And as I've said, now we're kind of down to the approach where we say, well, we know it's not legally required. This is a question of, do you want to make it mandatory in your workplace? And so that begs the question, what exactly does mandatory mean, right? It's not about holding somebody down and jabbing them with a needle. It's really a question of, you know, what's the best way to persuade our employees to become vaccinated? And the way I've put this to clients a few times is, you know, when you're contemplating the question of a vaccination policy, kind of reverse engineer the question. What are you trying to achieve with a policy, whether it's mandatory or whether it's voluntary? What are you trying to achieve? Well, you're probably trying to achieve the highest participation rate possible. You're trying to get to 95%, 98%, or 100%. So what's the best way to go about doing that? And, you know, that's where you go back to these key legal considerations, which will lend credibility to any vaccination policy, whether it's mandatory or whether it's voluntary. Somebody gave me an analogy a couple of days ago saying, you know, imagine if you went to an employee and said, I want you to drink this herbal tea. It prevents fatigue and it will reduce accidents. And if you don't drink this tea, then I'm going to put you on unpaid leave. Or I'm going to put a sticker on your chest that demonstrates that you're a potential hazard in the workplace. Or I'm going to terminate your employment. You know, how would you justify that kind? Now that's a silly example because who knows what's in this darn tea. But the considerations are exactly the same for a vaccination. If you're going to say to the employee, I really want you to become vaccinated, or I'm going to require that you become vaccinated, you're going to have to really explain to the employee how it's connected to their particular experience in the workplace, why you genuinely believe it's necessary in the workplace, and why there isn't an alternative that will be equally effective. And that's sort of the persuasive side of trying to get participation in your workplace. And to do that, you've got to assess a number of really key features. And this is very much a case-by-case sort of workplace-specific assessment. So what is the employee's frequency of public contact, and what does that contact look like? What is the effectiveness of your existing controls, your existing PPE, your distancing, your hygiene, etc.? The bullet's not on the screen here, but what is the experienced efficacy of the vaccines? In this particular case, what we're seeing on the news is that they're highly effective. And so that's very important. What about the folks that you serve? What's the vulnerability of the folks that you are serving and in the circumstances that you serve them? What are the alternative accommodations? What sorts of things can you put in place to safeguard employee privacy? And what information do employees have? I saw a very interesting policy a couple of days ago where it was a disclosure. So you need to disclose your vaccination status. And if your vaccination status was, I'm not getting it or I haven't got it yet, then there was a mandatory education process. You needed to attend a short education seminar of sorts, put on by the employer with experts who tried to educate the employee about the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Now that might be a little extreme, but the question you'll be thinking about, one question you should be thinking about, is what else can I do to increase the rate of voluntary compliance within my workplace? Another quick anecdote is a client who called and said, we've got 250 employees through a fairly informal, but we think pretty accurate sort of word of mouth. We know there's 8 people who haven't been vaccinated. So I want to impose a mandatory vaccination policy. And my question back was, but you're already at 98%, right? If you're in a workplace where you know that you've got excellent voluntary compliance with vaccination, maybe the last thing you need is to impose a mandatory vaccination policy, because you've only got a small handful of people who haven't vaccinated, and you can deal with them individually without imposing any kind of policy whatsoever. So then you say, Ryan, get on with it, answer the question, can vaccination be mandatory or not? And unfortunately, the answer remains maybe. There's no doubt that in some circumstances, an employer can implement policies that will require vaccination, but it absolutely has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And we do say seek legal advice if you're considering such a policy. And I think an important part of that legal advice, and I think we as a firm at Mathews have been pretty bullish on this topic, is that it's always a risk assessment. I've been talking to you about the various considerations and the potential liabilities, etc. But in almost every business decision that you make, there's risk associated with it. I mean, you might have a facility where there's a railing down the stairs that is aesthetically very pleasing, but it's small and it might cause somebody to trip. But that's the way you've outfitted your lobby, because it makes sense. There's risk involved in everything that you do. You might choose to implement a mandatory vaccination policy because you think it's the right thing to do. You think the vast majority of your employees will be compliant and won't be concerned about it. You think it'll be very effective in terms of your public perception and dealing with guests, and you're willing to take the risk that goes along with it. And so understanding what those risks is all part of that risk assessment and decision-making. Some of the essential components of a mandatory policy will include the following. It definitely needs to be in writing. It definitely has to include sufficient notice, not significant, but enough so that employees can have an opportunity to think about what it means and what it means for them. It has to be very clearly articulated and then consistently enforced. I would want it to have very clear references to privacy. So how you're going to safeguard confidentiality of the information that's received. I would want it to have a specific reference to human rights and accommodation, so that employees know that if they say, I have not been vaccinated and I don't intend to be vaccinated, they won't be immediately terminated or immediately treated differently, but rather that will trigger a larger discussion about the reasons they've said no and what potential accommodations might be available to them. And then we need to be crystal clear about the consequences of those who do not or cannot become vaccinated. So what is the alternative? Perhaps it's additional PPE, a mask, etc. Perhaps it's alternative assignments, different areas of a facility. I think we're going to see rapid testing become an important element of this, in as much as it might not be just vaccinate or mask, but maybe it's vaccinate or you'll be subject to rapid testing or assessments. Maybe it's workplace leave. Maybe it's just during an outbreak. Maybe it's just while community transmission is at a certain level. Maybe it's unpaid leave. Usually it will be. In some circumstances, probably not many of yours, remote work and work from home opportunities might exist. And then the ultimate, of course, would be termination. But anytime somebody thinks about, I might implement a mandatory policy, the very next question is, well, what will be the consequences of non-compliance? And you need to articulate that very clearly in your policy. In a unionized setting, there's no doubt that you're going to be engaged with the union. In fact, in most unionized settings, it will be difficult to impose this kind of a policy without involving the union. Now, there'll be some collective agreements that provide enough scope of management rights to do this unilaterally, but even if it's done unilaterally, you're going to get the attention of your union. And so union management relations is going to be an important consideration. And then this isn't the kind of policy where you write it, post it, and put it on the shelf and everything's fine for 6 months or a year from now, because this is an evolving situation. So any kind of vaccination policy, mandatory or voluntary, is the kind of policy that you're definitely going to want to revisit over time as the circumstances around us change. And then finally, before we go to some questions, what are some alternative considerations? And as I said, I think many employers have put their minds to a mandatory policy. And when they look at these alternatives, they realize maybe I don't need to go down that road. How effective have your current safety measures been, and how many of those safety measures can remain in place without reducing capacity, without reducing volume or the efficacy of your service to your customers? What is the anticipated voluntary vaccination rate? The example I just gave you is that if you're already at 95 or 98% by your best estimate, maybe you don't need to impose any sort of policy. If you've got a smaller workforce, and maybe even if you don't, consultation with employees can be very effective. That client I've just shared the anecdote with you, that's how they got that number of 8 of us among us have not been vaccinated. And they were pretty confident in that number because they had really effective consultation with employees. Employee morale is a really important one as well. This goes again, if you've got very high voluntary compliance rates, then making that mandatory could upset employees who have already chosen to do it voluntarily. They just don't like the idea of being told they have to do it. And so you need to have that as an important consideration. Do employees have enough information? Some employees have sort of put their head in the sand a little bit. It's a challenging question and they don't want to hear anything more about it. And sometimes an employer can be a useful source of information on vaccination. How easy are you making it? We see out of the States all kinds of government incentives, but employers do some things like that as well, in terms of time off, in terms of making sure that employees know that they'll be supported by their employer. If they have a couple of days of feeling gross after the vaccination, the employer will tolerate some absences, etc. I've seen a few employers do vaccination on site. That's a little more difficult in some jurisdictions, but something to consider. I talked about a really clear reference to your privacy policy. And then this last bullet doesn't really fit here, but I'll address it. There's some concerns about, well, what if I make the policy mandatory and an employee gets vaccinated and the vaccination makes them very ill, or they have a terrible adverse reaction, blood clot, etc. That is a risk. I think we're calling it a very low risk because we're seeing that the odds of a serious adverse reaction to a vaccination is actually quite low. But it is possible that if an employee, the law here is interesting. If it's clearly a mandatory policy and the vaccination makes the employee sick, it could be a work-safe claim. But even if the employee feels that it's mandatory, so even if just through persuasion and encouragement, the employee forms the good faith belief that it's mandatory, even that will be enough to make an adverse reaction to a vaccine a compensable claim. We haven't seen any of those yet. We don't anticipate seeing a lot of those because the numbers are just so low in terms of adverse reactions. So that's a whole lot of information at nearly an auctioneer's speed, but I wanted to get that sort of foundation out there. We've managed to get through a very interesting interruption, and we've saved some time for questions. So I'll stop there and I'll take questions.
Great, thanks so much, Ryan. We have a few in the chat here, which I will start with. What if you have employees who choose not to work with each other based on vaccination status? What are the employer's options to protect workers in that regard?
That's a good one. That's a very important question. And you really end up defaulting to the same protocol that you would for any refusal of unsafe work. And so when an employee says to his or her employer, I'm not going to do what you asked me to do because I don't think it's safe, there is a procedure mandated by occupational health and safety regulations whereby it starts with just general persuasion. It starts with just a discussion between the supervisor, frontline, and the employee that says, okay, tell me what your concerns are. Let me explain to you the safety protocols we have in place. And yes, some people are not vaccinated, but we've assessed the circumstances. We're following the public health orders. We're following our health and safety regulations. This is a safe workplace, just as it was 6 months ago and 6 months before that. If that's not successful, then depending on the size of your workplace, you go to the next level, which is engaging your health and safety committee if you have one, or your employee representative if you have one. But you're going to that next level of safety in the workplace, and you're essentially having the same conversation, but at a slightly elevated level, engaging those who are responsible for safety in the workplace. If that's not successful, you're contacting WorkSafe BC, and you're explaining to WorkSafe BC that I have a refusal of unsafe work. And it's a little different during the pandemic. It used to be that WorkSafe would dispatch somebody to your workplace pretty quickly. Now a lot of that's being done remotely. I'm hearing more of it's being done on site again. And if a WorkSafe BC officer assesses your safety plan, assesses what you have in place, and blesses it as being safe, now you go back to the employee and you're saying, well, look, you've heard from me, you've heard from our health and safety folks in the workplace, and now we've heard from WorkSafe BC that this is safe. So now you have to attend work. You still need to deal with the soft side of HR here. You still have an employee relations issue, but legally you're able to say, I've established this work is safe, and now it's attend work or suffer some consequences. As an employer, you might choose that the consequences, you're going home with an unpaid leave until you're comfortable coming back. But for a period of time, that might be a sufficient response for all parties. In other circumstances, it might be, well, I need you to attend. I've demonstrated that it's safe. WorkSafe says it's safe. If you don't attend, I'm going to treat you as abandoning your employment, and your employment will come to an end on that basis.
Right. Thank you for that. Can testing be made mandatory, or all the considerations around vaccinations the same for rapid testing?
No, the considerations aren't necessarily exactly the same. I think, so if I understand the question, is mandatory vaccination the same as mandatory testing? Does that sound? Sorry, Ingrid, I didn't catch the whole piece. I think you're asking, is mandatory?
I think they're asking, can you make rapid testing mandatory, or do the same rules apply to mandating vaccinations? I think there's examples, film or work camps, or like there's some sectors that are currently using rapid testing very actively. So are they mandated, and could one of these businesses mandate rapid testing, or do we need to proceed with the same sort of steps of caution?
Yes. So thank you. The answer is the considerations are very similar, because in this case, you're asking somebody to essentially present a body fluid, whether it's through a swab or whether it's through a spit test, to an employer to then basically assess their medical status. So that's definitely has the same considerations in terms of privacy and all of those things. Where I think we're going to see this go is in two directions. One, I think we're seeing rapid testing becoming much less invasive, right? So the employer is not sticking a swab up your nose, but there's some sort of preliminary test where if there's a positive, you go and get the PCR test thereafter. So it's less intrusive, less privacy intrusive, which I think is one. And then two, you're not asking somebody to put something in their body, right? So one of the assessments is just what is the degree of the intrusion of privacy, and mandating that somebody take a vaccine into their body is certainly less privacy intrusive than mandating that they share a saliva sample with you for a pre-test. So I think we're going to find that all the considerations are the same. What do you do with the information? How do you store it? What are the consequences of a positive test? Those considerations are the same, but ultimately imposing a requirement to be tested through a low privacy invasive measure is going to be less serious than insisting that they become vaccinated.
Right, that makes sense to me, Ryan. Now, here's a good question. Can you weigh in on whether we can prioritize our staff accommodation for those who have been vaccinated, as we do have several employees sharing a unit? I can see that being a very relevant question for ski.
Yeah, I think it is. And I did see a version of that question before. And, when we're talking about whether or not to make a vaccination policy mandatory, one of the questions is, what are the alternatives? And as an employer, I think it's pretty persuasive to say, look, the nature of this workplace is such that my employees have to bunk together. They have to stay together. So it's going to be extended periods of time where social distancing and personal protection equipment is simply not going to be effective. And so in this workplace, if the employees have to be accommodated in this way, we feel that vaccination is absolutely mandatory in these circumstances. Now, I think maybe to go further in that question, if you have the alternative to say, okay, well, we can carve off some space. So, maybe rooms on the west wing or this area of the facility can be used for those who have not been vaccinated. That I think that might be viable as well. So it's a mandatory policy per se, in as much as you need to report your vaccination status. And if your vaccination status is you're not going to do it, then we're not going to have you in the same accommodation as the others. I think that would be a pretty reasonable position for the employer to take.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about if your employees have to travel internationally for work, assuming that a vaccine or vaccinations would be mandated for travel in and out of Canada. Would an employer be able to require proof as a condition of employment?
So that goes back to, in one sense, it goes back to that bona fide occupational requirement consideration under human rights. So you say to the employee, look, a fundamental requirement of your job is to travel. And under these circumstances, the travel industry makes it such that you cannot travel unless you're vaccinated. So this is a lot like having a license, at least for this period of time. If you can't perform a fundamental element of your job, then that might certainly put your continued employment in jeopardy. It will still trigger the same duty to accommodate, in as much as you'll have to determine why it is the employee is not vaccinating, and then go through the process of considering, well, is there an accommodation that I can tolerate as an employer without imposing an undue hardship? And those kinds of accommodations might be alternative assignments for a period of time, might be an unpaid leave for a period of time if we think this is a temporary measure. But if there isn't an alternative that wouldn't result in an undue hardship to the employer, I think in those circumstances, you could contemplate termination of employment because the employee is simply not able to do a fundamental element of the job.
Right, that makes sense to me, Ryan. We have a question here about, the current employees are concerned about unvaccinated employees. So currently the majority would be vaccinated, and they're saying to the employer, if you're not mandating that I'm going to be surrounded by vaccinated employees, then I'll go and work somewhere else. And the challenge is, within our industry, we have a severe workforce shortage. Yeah. And so there is this desire from the employee base to ensure that everybody else is vaccinated. And I don't know whether or not that is a different answer for you than the one that you've already given it. It's extremely difficult, no doubt.
Yeah, I think in any one of these cases, there isn't going to be one consideration or criteria that's determinative. So I think if I was making an argument for an employer in support of its mandatory vaccination policy, I think one feature could certainly be that, we've had feedback from our employees and we've had feedback from our recruiters that we're simply unable to recruit and retain a workforce in the absence of a mandatory policy. The more concrete and objective your measurements can be and your evidence can be on that, the more persuasive it will be. But I'd be happy to use that as one of the arguments to say it's necessary in our workplace, not just for the health and safety of our employees, but for the viability of our workforce, because it's been our experience that without it, we don't think we can retain and recruit and retain a sufficient number of staff. Now, that argument wouldn't be very persuasive just based on speculation. Just based on your hunch or based on anecdotal evidence. The more objective you can be, the better. But I think the argument makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Noting we have a couple of more minutes here. If anybody has any additional questions, I'll just leave it for a moment or two. Okay, here's one from Michelle. For backcountry lodges, an exposure would trigger a 10+ day closure, which has a significant financial impact on the operation. In our operations, social distancing is often not possible, i.e. in snowcat shared accommodations. Does this qualify as undue hardship?
So one of the considerations of undue hardship is financial consequences. The persuasiveness of that consideration will always depend on the size and nature of the employer. So if you're part of a large operator with hundreds of employees and hundreds of thousands or $1 million in revenue, then a 10-day closure of one of your operations or one of your events is not going to be terribly persuasive. If you're a smaller operator, and that's a significant financial imposition on your viability, it'll be a much more persuasive factor. So again, always case by case, but I think for sure, I'd argue for a smaller operator to, we'd be objective. I wouldn't necessarily argue we'd open the books per se, but if we were able to say, shutting down for 10 days at this stage in our existence is really awfully close to do or die for us. We couldn't survive another one or two of those closures. And so, we need to have as much certainty as possible for the viability of the business. So yes, one of the factors towards undue hardship is financial consequences. And in the circumstances that I've described, I think we'd argue that as a very persuasive element in support of a mandatory policy.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And here's one more question. What if the employee refuses to disclose vaccination status? Can asking for the employee to disclose the status be a condition of employment?
So, that it's not a very different question than can I make vaccination mandatory, right? The question will be, if an employee refuses to disclose vaccination status, what's the consequence going to be? It could be termination, right? In the most extreme set of circumstances, and we've kind of discussed a few of those, where you've made it mandatory and there is no alternative accommodation. The consequence could be the end of your employment. Before you came to that conclusion, you would definitely want to inquire as to the reason that they've decided not to become vaccinated, because if it is a reason protected by the Human Rights Code and one of the protected grounds, whether it's health or mental or physical disability or religion, then even if there isn't a way to accommodate those things, you still have to go through the process. The Human Rights Tribunal is a bit like a math teacher who always says, show your work. You might get the right answer at the bottom, but you still have to show your work. You have to explain that I got the right necessary information about the disability or the religious belief. I considered it carefully. I considered alternatives, and there are none. There is no accommodation, but I've been through the process to get there. So for the employee who refuses to disclose status, first step is to understand why. The next step is to determine what are the potential outcomes. Is there a way to accommodate this? Is there a duty to accommodate? But if the answer to all those questions is no, then termination of employment may be a viable outcome.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Just noting the time, I'd like to take a moment. Tatiana, thank you so much for joining us and being our sponsor today. We couldn't do these webinars without sponsors like you, and I know that all of us have a need for uniforms. It's one of those things I've had as a challenge all my professional career, so thank you so much. Arun, Christopher, I'd like to thank you both for your partnership and your willingness to step forward together as a team to support this education session today. And Ryan, not only engaging, informative, but also a little bit lighthearted for an incredibly serious topic right now that impacts all of us. I'd like to thank you very much for making yourself available and sharing your expertise today.
Thank you for having me. Just a closing comment. In a seminar like this, there's usually more unanswered questions than answered questions. If we've left anything on the floor, you know how to get a hold of me. I'd be happy to answer them off the cuff. We don't have to arrange anything formal. If I've left you with lingering questions, you know where to find me, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Ryan, thank you for that. That's very generous. The recording and the webinar will be, or the slide deck will be available. So it will be posted, and if you'd like to share it with any of your teams or anybody that wasn't able to join us today, please feel free to do so. It will rest on our website, bcha.com. Thank you so much again, and be safe out there.